We start this newscast with a name, Seymour Hersh, the reporter who wrote the very detailed story of how the CIA, under the direction of the Biden administration, blew up the Nord Stream pipelines. He has a new article out. It's called The Cover-Up. And tonight, he's going to join us to talk about his latest reporting. By the way, this new article by Seymour Hersh, which you can read for yourself on Substack, and you should, could easily be called the cover story instead of the cover up, because it seems to reveal how our government had to come up with or plant a cover story to compete with the one written by Mr. Hersh originally to explain who blew up the pipelines. Interestingly enough, that cover story is now being widely disseminated. Der Spiegel in Germany, the New York Times, and it goes something like this. The people who blew up the pipeline have nothing to do with the CIA. It's a rogue team of saboteurs who are pro-Ukrainian, but they don't represent the Ukrainian government. Now, at this point, I want to add something on a bit of a personal note. I like to jog with the New York Times podcast. Try to do it daily. In fact, it's called Daily. So recently I was listening and I heard one of the guys who wrote this story, this new story in the New York Times, same people who ignored the previous story presented by Mr. Hersh. Suddenly he's asked, while I'm listening to him on this podcast, why he's reporting that these saboteurs did it and how he's sure that the CIA didn't do it. His answer, to my absolute astonishment, was this: because he asked his U.S. intel sources and they say they didn't do it. Now, I should add, the Times is not the only news entity that ignored the blockbuster Seymour Hersh story. CNN and the rest of the cablers did the same thing. In fact, there was a time when CNN would have wanted to know more about Mr. Hersh's story, and they would have interviewed him. I know, because I was part of that CNN. I interviewed Mr. Hersh on several occasions at CNN. Apparently, they don't do that anymore. Let me show you something. If CNN did want a reason to look into whether our government had something to do with the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, all they really had to do was go into their own coverage of Mr. Biden saying this.
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will, I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
You gotta love the smirk, huh? That was after, according to Mr. Hersh's reporting, Mr. Biden had already been involved in meetings on how possibly they would destroy the pipelines. By the way, you gotta love just the way he presents it, right? And then one final thing about why the Hersh story should probably not have been ignored. And this is important, because I know many of you are watching us from all over the world, probably millions and millions and millions of you, and maybe you're not familiar with Mr. Hersh. Maybe you're not familiar with Mr. Hersh's work. So let me add something. Seymour Hersh is, journalistically speaking, a legend. And this may sound almost weird because it doesn't happen anymore, or it seems like it doesn't happen anymore, or less. But reporters are supposed to question their government's leaders, not do PR for them. In fact, they're supposed to have an adversarial relationship with them. That's what we're actually taught when we study this stuff in journalism school. Have an adversarial relationship. Cy Hersh epitomizes that type of journalism. I mean, this guy broke the My Lai massacre story, exposing lies that our military told, which helped to bring an end to the Vietnam War. He broke the Abu Ghraib story, exposing the futility of the Iraq War. He was in the Pentagon Papers, the Watergate, Henry Kissinger, Syria. Listen, I could go on. In fact, in large measure, this story matters. This story matters. I have to say this because of Cy Hersh. And yeah, journalistically speaking, the guy's kind of a legend. And he's also good enough to join us now to talk about some of his latest reporting. Cy, thanks so much for being with us.
Hey, you better tell everybody we're not brothers-in-law. That was a pretty overwhelming introduction.
Yeah.
But you happen to be from the class of people who believe in journalism, which doesn't seem to be the class that exists today. You know, it's been, I think, in all fairness, Trump scared the hell out of and most of the more or less liberal or straight press. They were just terrified by it. So they're back to, that's just one reason. But, as you said, I worked for the New York Times for 7 or 8 years and wrote all kinds of stories. And I would say of the 800 stories or whatever, maybe 5% had a source in it by name. Most of them were written because you can't get people in the community. So the rap on me on this story was unnamed sources, which is really tiresome, because how could and the fact the story you mentioned that the Times wrote, where the reporter sort of disavowed what he even had written, that had 3 unnamed sources in it too. It's just, so we're in a really funny stage. It's a post-Trump stage. I think the New York Times and the Washington Post, the liberal media, and I would include CNN and MSNBC as opposed to Fox News. Although I must say, Tucker Carlson and Fox News reported what I wrote right away, right up front.
Yeah.
But the other enters didn't, and they just did not. And ask me if the Senate or the House have done anything about it. Of course, the Democratic Senate, Chuck Schumer, the House Speaker, the idea that they would ask for an investigation into a Democratic president, we've come a long way wrong in the last 30, 40 decades.
Let's go to this latest story, and I would love to know what you think from your own experiential standpoint of why the United States seems to have, and I'll use this word and you tell me if it's overused, not in this case, invented or planted this most recent story. Why are they doing this?
Because the United States knows who did it. They know the president did it. Another way of asking this question that no reporter is asked in a press conference, that we blew up the pipeline and Biden's okay. A group of CIA officers and other agencies were put together, and early this year, last year, about a year ago at this time, and they did the hard work in Norway. I've written about that. But so after, all you have to do is to ask, if you're in the White House press corps, say to the president or to the press secretary one day, have you guys ever done, as the president ever tasks, that's the word they use in the military, in the intelligence community, the White House, the president tasks them to do an all-source study of who did the bomb, who blew it up. And, we have incredible intelligence. We have signals intelligence. We have assets. We have most of the countries in the Europe work with us. We could have had an answer to that story, in a few days. But of course, nobody's asked, and the White House is not going to do it because they know who did it. Why ask and do it? Why have it on the record? So it's all, and the story is falling apart, and there's pressure. What happened?
Do you think so? Very few of us seem to want to cover this story. And when I read the story that you wrote, it's a fascinating story. And what I find best about the story is it's very detailed. You have conversations, meetings, dates, et cetera, et cetera. It's hard to question that. And yet it seems to be taking a long time for people to say, oh, my God, we did it again. Our government, our CIA did something we probably shouldn't have done.
At the order of the president. And in the story I wrote, the last sentence, if I remember, this is the initial story I've written. I've been writing for Substack for not that long. I didn't know much about it. It's quite a medium. I think they had 1 million hits on the story within 20 hours. That's because there's a lot of journalism that isn't going out right now. And there are many people, not just in America, this is an international thing. Many people around the world understand that they're not getting from the American press, from the New York Times, Washington Post, the kind of reporting they should get, particularly on the war. If you read the New York Times, you would think the Ukrainian army is doing quite well. But it's going to be Putin's call, and that doesn't mean I like Putin. No. He started, this is the guy that started the bloodiest war we've had in Western Europe since World War II, and you can always fault him for that. It's not about that; it's about us, and Biden, the president's. My explanation for what's going on is Biden he wants to be reelected again. He's not in full command. We can see it. I mean, he's okay, but he's not in full command. He's tired. He's close to 80, and there's a lot of problems in the country he's not dealing with. And presidents always find that war is a big plus. When you go to war, you get a lot of points. You always do. Bill Clinton learned this in the worst days of his presidency. Once he started bombing, he bombed Iraq, 5 months into the presidency, when he was under great trouble because of his demand that the Army accepts don't ask, don't tell. Remember, he was being criticized,
yeah.
And he didn't have the guts to say, he did not have the guts to tell the members of the Joint Chief, if you don't like my policy, give me your resignation. Instead, he just waffled around. Then he did a bombing in May. I remember I was at a ballpark with my kid, and there was an announcer made, anybody in the government, go home. I was at the,
Me too.
It must have been in Baltimore. Go home. And so I knew something was up. And I was then working for the New Yorker and a magazine. And the next day, sure enough, they had bombed Baghdad, killed 8 people. It was the first time America had ever struck a major city in the Middle East. The next day, he goes to church on Sunday. It was a Saturday that the bombing took place. He goes to church and he's a hero. The press are all over him. They're all over every word. That works. So Biden jumped on Ukraine. He's going to support it all the way.
But not just on Ukraine, Cy. I mean, this particular case that you write about, I mean, we go to Norway, we find divers, we take the ones here in my state, Pensacola area, Florida, we combine them, we send them on this mission, they go 260 feet underground, they plant essentially bombs, C4, on concrete, blow up these things. This whole story is, I don't know, like something out of a 007 movie, and yet we're doing it thinking no one's going to find out?
Yeah, well, I could tell you one thing about the CIA. When it wants to do something down and dirty, they know how to keep it. They know how to keep it small. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The people who know are very small. And the president wasn't really getting briefed. The CIA director was the funnel point.
Yeah.
The guys in the field. And the less that the White House knows, the better, because it's a talkative White House. And so the president knew they were ready to do it. That's why
So Biden was talking directly to the operational guys, and that's it. None of his chief of staff or the rest of those folks were really involved in this because it would have leaked.
Well, the fear was we happen to have a very unique bunch of guys. They're all very, very anti-communist, and they're yapping a lot. I mean, we have a Secretary of State who was supposed to go to Beijing to meet his counterpart, and he didn't go because of a balloon. Remember that? He didn't go because of a balloon. I mean, are you kidding me? And we're very hostile to all things communist. We're very hostile to Chinese. The language is enough to provoke the hell out of everybody. And, we're in a situation now where we're not top dogs. What happened in the last month? China cut a deal with Saudi Arabia, which is Sunni.
Yeah.
And the Sunnis to go to Shia Iran and cut a deal for oil and energy right behind our back. And not only that, I'm told, and I think it's probably going to happen soon, China, which buys about 20 to 25% of Saudi Arabia's enormous oil they put out, is going to start paying in yen and not in the dollar. And so what does Saudi Arabia get out of it? The Iranians then cut back on their people they support in Yemen, the Houthis, and the war ends there.
There really is so much to talk about. We're speaking with legendary investigative journalist Seymour Hersh. Cy, do me a favor, stick around. When we come back, a little deeper dive into this conversation. This is after we come back from the break, but before we go, hey, welcome back. I'm Rick Sanchez. We're talking with investigative journalist Seymour Hersh about his recent work uncovering who was behind the Nord Stream pipeline's destruction. And we return now. Cy, I mentioned this a little while ago, but as I was reading your story, I was thinking, I would hope that we still have people within our own government, maybe people in the intelligence community, who feel the need, the desire to speak out when they see some of the things that we do that we ought to know about, that are questioned. I imagine that is what led some of the people to talk to you. Am I right?
I'll put it another way, because I don't like to talk specifically about anything. But after I did My Lai was a massacre we did in Vietnam, and I'd been in the Army. I'm old enough that you had to go in the Army compulsory, and I know how to shoot an M1 and put together a machine gun with my eyes blindfolded. So I could imagine the Army that I was in the early '60s was an Army capable of murdering 500 people in cold blood, and not only murdering, but raping the woman and then mutilating many of them. Really horrible stuff. and I couldn't imagine it. And so when I did that story, almost anybody who had any sense in Vietnam, the officers in particular, they knew how bad it was. And so I was a voice for them. So over the next, when I went on to write for the New Yorker magazine and the New York Times, et cetera, the people that come to me, and our government's full of people like this, not in the intelligence service, in the State Department, everywhere. When you take the oath of office in America, you have to do it every year. Certain officers do. These guys, it's for them. It's not to the general or the admiral or to the president. It's to the Constitution, and there are those people there. And if you're a third generation American or fourth generation whose family has been in war and been in combat for America, you go in there happily, and then and rather than get disillusioned, you do your job, but you do have a sense that there is. I just can't get into source stuff, but you're not wrong in the idea that the people I talk to are people that want their job to be better. And I'll put it another way. They want their president to make better choices. I think that's fair enough.
You write about a course correction, by the way, that I was fascinated by. They had really originally planned to blow these things up within 48 hours. And then somehow there was some information sent to them saying, no, apparently because we were doing military exercises just prior to that, and it seemed like the whole world would know, oh, as soon as the military exercises end, something blows up. Was that the reason? And take me through that if you could.
The whole idea was, the problem was the difficulty of the mission. And it was, by the way, what the intelligence community did there was quite spectacular, even though they didn't like the end. But they were given an assignment, come up with an option. If you want to blow up the pipelines, you have to do it in such a way that we can't be blamed, right? And what they wanted to do, the fear was that at some point, as the Ukrainian war against Russia continued, and despite all the optimistic reporting you get from my old newspaper, the New York Times, where I worked for 7 or 8 years, it was a great newspaper back then. I don't know why they're in this tack they are now of just being sort of a playpen, a playboy for the Democrats in the White House, which they are by and large. The war is, by September, when Biden said, let's do it, and gave the order, the war was certainly stalled out. And we've put now $120 billion into that war. And Western Europe was being asked to give more and more. And the concern was they could see in Western Europe and in Germany what we weren't being told too much, that this war was going nowhere.
So they were concerned if it blew up right after our ships or our military exercises that we were doing there happened, everybody would know we were involved, right?
You're exactly right about that. So the idea was to wait. But why he picked 3 months and 3.5 months to wait was the question I wondered. Why did he suddenly do it in late September? Because to get back to the point, the war wasn't going well. And even though the press was describing how Ukraine was really great, wonderful, standing up, which they were. I mean, they don't like Russians any more than America likes Putin, rather. Russians are different. Yeah. Russians are good people. The government is. We're not talking about people. We're talking about governments.
Right.
So what happened is, the best guess I have, the best guess the people who were involved in this were very disillusioned by it, is he was afraid that Europe was going to begin to walk away, particularly the Germans. Germans after World War II are not interested in the big military, and they were being asked to produce more tanks. And the pipeline that Schultz controlled, full of gas, and winter's coming up now. It happened to be a mild winter, which was okay, but winter's coming up for Europe, and the fear was he was going to open up the pipeline and do his job as chancellor. He was going to make the people warm, make the businesses happy. And so we didn't give him that option. We took away the option. The only explanation that makes sense to me and a lot of other people involved is that he blew up the pipeline. Whether Schultz knew about it at the time or not is not clear. I don't know, but he certainly afterwards he's not been part of the people screaming for an investigation. He's done anything to stop it. And so what Western Europe doesn't have any gas and oil. We've always had Western Europe's back. We supported Western. It's been a model of democracy. What we did after World War II is we've really turned a lot of countries, all the European countries, into model countries.
But with this action, aren't we, Cy, leaving them out in the cold? Quite literally leaving them out in the cold?
More than the cold. It's desperate there now. It's inflation like you've never seen. They're trying to get by with LNG, liquefied natural gas, that doesn't produce enough, and it costs 3-4 times as much. They're not going to have enough gas to keep their people warm. And not only in Germany, but Western Europe. The Russian gas was so much that Germany was able to sell what they call downstream. They had companies that sell the Russian gas that we had too much of downstream to other companies. It's all gone now. In France right now, they're paying some places are paying 5 times as much for electricity because they've always had gas from Germany. The turbines that produce electricity are run by gas, not by coal. And they shut down some nuclear sites. They may reopen, but they shut them down because they were dangerous.
I got to ask you about the potential existential effect of something like this. I worry as an American. Look, I don't want World War III, okay? I don't want to go to war with China. I don't want to go to war with Russia. But it scares me to think that my beloved country would be doing something like this, where we would destroy the infrastructure of another country, no less a country with more nuclear warheads than we have, and the potential effect that could have. Oftentimes, the first act in wars is the destruction of infrastructure. Well, my God, if we did this, as you report, that's exactly what this is. How worried should we be about this?
You couldn't have, you're my pitch man on this stuff, man. That's great. That's exactly what we're done. And I don't think Biden thought through the consequences of the hatred of Russia, the hatred of communism. And don't forget, the war for him in the beginning, everybody was for it. Let's go show the commies. Yeah. But it's not working out well. The sanctions haven't worked. McDonald's may be gone, but there's still people selling hamburgers there. And the country is not dying. The people are living. I'm sure the economy's down a little bit. He's not getting the same money, but he's making do. He's
you just made me think of something. Do you think if the American people knew that we did this, rather than not knowing, because they watch CNN and MSNBC and Fox and read the New York Times, and there's no way that they can know unless, they're a very small minority. Do you think if our people, if we Americans knew what we did, we would hold it against our government right now? We would call Biden to question for it?
I think it's not happening now because they don't know really very much about it. There's been no press coverage. Right. I'm a guy that won an awful, my wife won't let me hang up any prizes anywhere. I got boxes of them. No, none of them in the house. I won an awful lot of prizes in my life. And
that's what I worry about. Are we as Americans concerned enough to act on this type of information if we were to know?
I don't know. All I know is that the anti-communism and the language that comes out of Biden and his Secretary of State Blinken and his National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who was a big pusher for expanding NATO in his earlier life, and the Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland, who was responsible and involved in the overthrow of a pro-Russian government in 8 years ago, 2014. I call that gang Blinken, and nod. Like the child story, because they're all on the same page. Communism sucks, screaming and yelling. What can I tell you?
You're great, and I'm sorry to say we're out of time. We could continue.
I know. I just want to say one more thing. You can cut it if you have to.
Go ahead.
This summer and fall is going to be a disaster for Europe, and it's going to fall on Biden's head. And what he wanted to do is to lock up a chance for re-election or be renominated. He's going to blow it. He's going to blow it. It's not going to happen.
Your prediction. Seymour Hersh, legendary old world journalist, as we like to say. There may be a few of us left. Thank you, Cy, for joining us and sharing your wisdom and your knowledge.
Well, just teach me how to sink a 5-foot birdie putt, because I haven't done it in years. That's what I want you to do. Goodbye, buddy.
Well said. We so appreciate it. Before we go, I want to remind you of our mission here. It's pretty simple. We kind of want to de-silo the world. We've got to stop living in these little boxes. Truths don't live in boxes. They're everywhere. I'm Rick Sanchez. I'll be looking for you again right here, where I hope to provide you with a direct impact.